very much. And now it is my wonderful, wonderful pleasure and privilege to introduce one of the greatest gentlemen, scholars, authors, friends that Laurie and I and my family have ever had the pleasure and privilege to know, Rabbi Dr. Gutierrez has certainly graced our bima and pulpit in Irving many times, and it's always been a wonderful pleasure. So it is a spectacular pleasure to introduce our wonderful friend who will now deliver his message that I think will be extremely, extremely compelling. And we're very grateful to you for doing this. Thank you very much.
Let me begin, first of all, by thanking Rabbi Joseph and Lori for the gracious invitation. I know that they've been working on this at other times as well. They've invited me down, just my schedule hasn't worked out. It's an honor to be here with you, and I want to wish you a very sincere mazel tov. Congratulations. I'm the rabbi of a small community as well, and just the idea of 75 years is extremely impressive. May you merit to see another 75 years of success and growth. Hatzlacha to all of you, and it's just a tremendous pleasure to be here with you. I wanted to begin with a quote from someone by the name of the Count of Paredes, Rodrigo Manrique, writing in the 15th century. He wrote about an individual whose name was Juan Poeta de Valladolid. And Juan Poeta, for those of you who speak Spanish, was a poet. What was interesting about Juan is that he was born a Jew, but he converted to Christianity sometime in the early decades of the 15th century. And the Count of Paredes writes the following. He says, all of these are his name. Juan, Simuel, a reference to Shmuel, and Redouan. Redouan is an Arabic name. He says, a Moor, so he will live, a Christian, so he will be worth more, but a Jew he is. And then he adds this last tantalizing line, as far as I can tell. Now, that sentiment that the Count of Paredes shares about Juan Poeta having multiple identities, which one is the real one is the question, is the sentiment that old Christians, that is to say that those individuals who were Christians before the tragic violence of 1391 would eventually adopt toward the conversos in the Iberian Peninsula. Are they really Jews? Are they really Christians? Are they a hybrid of these two religious groups? Now, in the aftermath of the tragedy of 1391, if you step back in time, the Iberian Jewish community represented the largest Jewish communities in Europe at the time. 70 Jewish communities in Castile and Aragon were violently attacked, as many of you know, resulting in perhaps a third of the Jewish community converting to Christianity or to Catholicism. Another third, scholars debate, may have perished as a direct consequence of the violence or as a result of the economic devastation that they suffered, actual starvation, things of this nature. And then only a third of this great once Jewish community in Castile and Aragon lived as openly practicing Jews. Now, in the immediate aftermath of the violence of 1391, the church saw these conversos as a miracle. They saw the scales falling off of the Jewish community from their perspective. They saw prophecy as they interpreted it being fulfilled. They were coming to the message as they believed of the truth of Christianity. But that sentiment would actually change very quickly. It's interesting because there was even a story that took the Hanukkah story and turned it on its head. All of you know that during Hanukkah, the great miracle is that the oil continued to last through the period of consecration of the new oil. Well, among the priests, they said, well, the holy chrism would never run out as they were converting tens of thousands of conversos. So they took the story and they inverted it on its head. But there was a problem. The problem is that after the euphoria of these mass conversions, people began to sort of notice something. The conversos were living in the same neighborhoods that they had been living in before. They had Jewish family that had not converted. They were eating the same foods. They were participating in life cycle events, Brit Milah, Kiddushin, marriage, all these different things. But what was interesting is that they were no longer tied to the restrictions that had increasingly been applied to the Jewish community, in particular in Castile. Jews could not carry weapons, they had to dress distinctively, they might have to wear a special hat or a badge depending upon the locality. And conversos now, as legally Christian, were sort of set free from those restrictions. But that actually created another issue. There was nothing distinctive about the conversos in general that made them look different from old Christians being the descendants of the Visigoths or the Hispano-Romans that had occupied the Iberian Peninsula for centuries. So the question now was, well, if we can't tell who is Jewish, how do we know that these conversos are not actually trying to subvert Christian society? Now, the reason that the conversos converted is something that we'll delve into. But this issue became initiated a crisis that would begin in 1391 and would continue for more than 100 years. It would create a social, political, economic, and most importantly, religious crisis in Castile and Aragon. Because it was one thing for Jews to practice Judaism, but for conversos who were now legally Christian to circumcise their sons, to attend Yom Kippur services, to fast, not to eat pork, this was considered Judaizing. And the church was not only concerned about this heresy as they understood it, they considered that to be a very severe heresy. The issue was the effect and the influence that conversos had on old Christians. We know, for example, that there were old Christians that were still interested in Judaism despite the tragic violence that had been perpetuated in 1391. So now the church, as time passed in the 15th century, began to say, we have a cancer that is growing not only among conversos returning to their true identity, but they're actually bringing in old Catholics, old Christians along with them as well. In fact, when we read the document, the Edict of Expulsion in 1492, that was given by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, specifically states the reason that they believed that the expulsion was necessary. After having established an Inquisition, there were Inquisitions before that, but the Spanish Inquisition was specifically targeting Judaizing among conversos. And the monarchs believed that it had been ineffective, despite the fact that thousands had been arrested, thousands had been burned at the stake. There's a lot of scholarly debate as to the exact number, but it was clear from the perspective of the monarchs that it had not been successful. So the only solution, and I dare say the final solution from their perspective, was to expel Jews from the peninsula. Why? Because the Edict of Expulsion tells us that these individuals, the Jewish community, were providing assistance to conversos, teaching them Hebrew, teaching them when the holidays, the Chagim, were about to come, giving them kosher food, giving them kosher books. Whatever it was that they needed, the Jewish community was there to help their brothers. Now, let's step back in time for a little bit. The Jewish communities of Castile and Aragon, as well as those in Portugal and those in Granada and also in Navarre, had existed for more than 1,000 years. Archaeologically speaking, we know that there were Jews in the Iberian Peninsula, certainly from probably the 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era, much likely far before that. But one of the most interesting literary texts that provides us with evidence of the existence of Jews in the peninsula is actually a church synod that occurred in the 4th century, 303, in the town of Elvira. And with the synod, it gathered priests and bishops from different Cartagena and Elvira, different towns in the area. And one of the things that they record for us is their attitude and their concern about the Jewish population. The Synod of Elvira commands Christians in the area to not eat with Jews, telling us, of course, that that was in fact happening. There were friends. People had them over for lunch. They had them over to their homes. The Synod ordered Christians not to ask Jews to bless their fields and pray for the success of the non-Jews, of the Christian crops. So we, of course, know that that was happening. They were told not to consult with Jews for medical advice, the Jewish doctors at the time. And most importantly and most significantly, they were told that it was unacceptable for Christians to give their daughters in marriage to Jews, which of course tells us that there was intermarriage, and we assume that these women were in essence converting to Judaism. Now, the situation of Jews in the Roman Empire had been relatively peaceful, despite the challenges that were met as a consequence of the various Jewish rebellions against the Roman Empire in the late 1st century and into the 2nd century. The situation began to change once the Christianization of the empire began in full force with the Emperor Constantine and then finally with the Emperor Theodosius at the end of the 4th century. But Jews were citizens of the Roman Empire, and thus they had some measure of protection. There were increasing restrictions that were applied, but for the most part, they could still function as openly Jewish communities. As many of you remember your history, eventually the empire in the west would decline, and the Visigoths, these Germanic tribes that had settled initially in the Eastern Roman Empire, would travel to the west, they would sack Rome, and eventually, on the basis of a treaty with the Western Roman Empire, they would settle in the southern portion of France and in the Iberian Peninsula. There, they would maintain law codes for Visigoths, and they would maintain law codes for the Roman citizens, which included Jews. Now, the Visigoths were what we call Arian Christians. They didn't believe that Jesus was fully divine. Now, whether that actually gave them a different perspective on Jews is unclear. But their attitude towards Jews wasn't negative, one might say, but that would eventually change. In the 6th century, in the year 589, King Rakered I, one of the Visigothic kings, converted from Arianism to what we would call Chalcedonian Christianity, the type of Christianity that was prevalent in the East, in the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. And one of the things that we have to remember is that the Byzantines, if you remember your high school history, under Justinian the Great, had actually reconquered much of the territory in the West that had been lost. In fact, there were actually Roman troops from the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, in the southern part of the Iberian Peninsula. Now, whether it was because of that or because of the theological influences, Rakered adopted a negative stance toward Jews, beginning to restrict their freedom, property issues, different things that the roles that Jews could participate in. That would continue into the 7th century, into the 600s, reaching the point of King Sisput in the year 612. King Sisput declared that all Jews in his territory were to convert or to undergo exile. Now, we have different sources. We have some Catholic sources. We have an Arabic source that tell us that perhaps up to 90,000 Jews converted to Christianity. And they remained within the domains of the Visigothic kingdom. But the nature...
Convert or undergo what?
They underwent... they had to go conversion or they had to leave. They had to go undergo exile.
Exile, okay.
So they converted, but the nature of the conversions was very clear. Because over the next, essentially 100 years, or not 100 years, but until the end of the 8th century, there were a series of church councils in Toledo. And one of the topics of discussion is the issue of these Jews, of these Christians, quote unquote, that are circumcising their sons, they're marrying each other, they are celebrating Passover, they're not eating certain foods. And this topic is a recurring theme in the church councils that happen in Toledo over and over and over. It shows us that the ability of the Visigoths to actually enforce the conversion was very limited, but it shows us that the Jewish community was like, okay, we underwent baptism, great, we'll just continue on to do what we're doing. And there was a certain ability for them to live this dual life. So we talk about the idea of dissimulation, of pretending to embrace something openly, while retaining your true sentiments and your true beliefs internally. Now, as we're going to march through Jewish history in the peninsula, we're going to see that dissimulation is something that is part and parcel of the Jewish experience there. Now, I would argue to you that it's not something foreign to the history of the Jewish people. We can go back to the Tanakh, to the Hebrew Bible. We see the case of Abraham Avinu, Abraham, who pretends that Sarah is his sister. Isaac does the same thing with Rivka. David pretends to be mad before one of the kings of the Philistines to extricate himself from a very dangerous situation. Even in last week's parashah, we have Rachav who lies to the king, telling him that the spies have left. Now, obviously, the Bible includes perspectives on martyrdom that are different as well. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, those were individuals that were willing to be martyred. But the Talmud itself includes two different options, one to lie and pretend, and the other to confront martyrdom in certain cases. As we continue through the 6th century, the 600s, we eventually get to raids that are conducted by Muslims from North Africa. And in the year 711, there's a Muslim invasion that is able to defeat the Visigothic kingdom very quickly. Now, the Muslims, primarily Berbers and some Arabs, are not numerically significant. So they have sort of a problem because, of course, the Christian population is the major concern. They're outnumbered. That is, the Muslims are outnumbered by the Christian population. So they seek, to a certain extent, allies that will, in essence, facilitate their progression throughout the peninsula. And the natural ally is, in essence, the Jewish community. Muslims and Jews saw each other, at least theologically, one could argue, closer to each other than either party with respect to Christians. And of course, Christians had increasingly subjugated and oppressed the Jewish community, so there was no sense of loyalty there. And as we see throughout history, I'm compressing all this down, in very general terms. We see that the Jewish community enjoyed a measure of stability and peace for several centuries. We talk about the golden age of Jewish Spain or the Iberian Peninsula in the 900s into the 10th and 11th centuries. I would say that we have to be careful of painting that too idealistically. There was certainly a greater measure of freedom that was given to Jews, but there was also periods of violence. There were groups like the Almovarids and the Almohadiz. The Almohadiz were like the ISIS of that time. They persecuted Muslims, Christians, Jews, it didn't matter. And in fact, this is one of the reasons, the Almohadiz were the reasons that the Rambam, Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, and his family have to flee from Cordova, which is the old center of the Caliphate of Cordova. And according to most scholars, they actually converted to Islam, or they feigned, they dissimulated. They flee to North Africa, and eventually the Rambam will find his way to Fustat in the Fatimid Caliphate. So the Almohades or the Almohadiz are in essence an attempt by Muslim forces to check the resurgence of the Christian kingdoms, the vestiges of the Visigoths that had fled north during the Muslim invasions had begun to see that there was weakness among the Muslim forces, and slowly but surely they began to retake the peninsula, the famous Reconquista. Now, one of the things that happens is, of course, Jewish fortunes under the Muslims have now changed. There were many great individuals that you've heard of, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, Solomon ibn Gabidol, the individual, the poet that wrote Adon Olam, and Dunash ben Labrat, who wrote the Doro Yikra, Abraham ibn Ezra, Moshe ibn Ezra, many great scholars and philosophers, sort of reaching the apogee with the Rambam, were the product of this environment with Christians and Jews and Muslims present. But Jewish fortunes declined as a consequence of these Islamic persecutions. And what we find is that as Islam's power began to wane and they moved toward the southern portions of the peninsula, the Christian kingdoms began to fill in that power vacuum and take control. And as a consequence, many Jews actually fled from the southern portions of the peninsula into Christian lands, where they were initially guaranteed protection from the monarchs. They needed the monarchs in Castile and Aragon and the different kingdoms, because they changed names at times, needed individuals to populate those areas, but they needed individuals that had certain skills that could serve as tax collectors, tax farmers, and money lenders. And they saw these Jewish communities as an excellent means of buttressing the very delicate status of these kingdoms in the north. Now, from the perspective of the monarchs, these Jewish communities were essentially owned by the monarchs. That is to say, they were the property of the monarchs. There were certain benefits that the Jewish community would garner, but there were certain obligations that were also incumbent upon them. giving the monarchs forced loans, grants, and serving, of course, as the tax collectors did not endear the Jewish community to the old Christian population as well as to the Muslim population. Now, the Jewish community would do extremely well into the middle decades of the 14th century until the period of the civil wars in Castile. One of the individuals, Henry the Trastamara, would essentially push his right to the throne of Castile based on anti-Jewish sentiment. He would argue that there was too much Jewish influence in positions of authority. Sounds familiar? He argued that his half-brother had an affair with a Jewess, which apparently was true, and that the only reason or the only way to reclaim the kingdom was to extricate the Jewish influence that was, stretching its hand over old Christians. He would massacre different Jewish quarters, Jewish communities, and eventually he would defeat his brother, Pedro, and he would take the throne. But as soon as he takes the throne, he doesn't forget that the Jewish community serve very important purposes, and he retains them in those positions. But unfortunately, the mindset of the population has changed. There's an animus that is projected against the Jewish community that continues in the 1360s and the 1370s until the arrival of an archdeacon by the name of Ferran Martinez. He begins to argue that, again, Jews are a threat to the gospel, the integrity of Christianity. They have to be extricated, they have to be limited, and eventually, of course, they have to convert. Now, his sermons that continue for roughly, 12, 13 years, eventually lead to the violence that I talked about in 1391. And the individuals that converted could draw back on Jewish history in the peninsula. They could think about the Jews that had converted under the Visigoths, and they could think about the fact that they had been able to maintain a Jewish identity that was able to recover and come out of the closet, one might say. They could go back to the times of the Muslim hegemony in the peninsula, and they could think about the Rambam and other Jewish communities that had converted and were able to return eventually. Now, in Islam, there is a concept that many of you may have heard of. It's called taqiyya. Taqiyya means to dissimulate, to pretend. Now, Islam has a very different conception of martyrdom than Christianity. Christianity has that vision of Daniel in the lion's den, of an individual being forced to give up their belief in Jesus by the Romans and then being crucified. They see that as the ultimate expression of a martyr. But Islam doesn't have that notion. For Islam, a martyr is someone who dies in the midst of battle, of jihad, of an individual who dies inflicting punishment or judgment upon the enemy. So they don't see anything wrong with dissimulation. You pretend, you extricate yourself, and then you return. In fact, we have dialogues in different Islamic texts that talk about individuals that were captured by Christian crusaders. They're tortured, they're made to blaspheme Muhammad the Prophet. The individual escapes, and then he sort of has a vision of talking to Muhammad, and Muhammad tells him, how is your heart? He says, well, I had to say certain things, and Muhammad tells him, it's okay. Your heart remained true. If you get captured again, do it again. Because in that mentality, survival is the most important. And one of my contentions is that the Jewish community, having undergone extensive cultural Arabization and Islamification in many ways, the Moreh Nebuchim and many great Jewish works were written in Arabic. The Rambam studied the great philosophical works of Muslim philosophers. It's inevitable that these elements would have come in. And so the idea of dissimulation was not something that presented itself necessarily as perhaps ideal, but it was an option on the table. Now, it's important to remind ourselves that this idea of dissimulation is not something that is limited to the Jewish community. And in fact, it's not limited to the Iberian Jewish experience. We know of crypto-Jews, one might say, in North Africa. We know about them in the Ottoman Empire. We know about them in Iran. We know about them in Kurdistan. In fact, we know, based on the writings of Rabbi Yehuda Chassid and his Sefer Chassidim, writing in the Rhineland area, in the lands of Ashkenaz, that even crypto-Judaism was present among German Jews. It wasn't something that was emphasized because, in some sense, Germanic Jewry saw Christians who were willing to die for their faith, and they thought this is the ultimate model that we should follow. We shouldn't also forget that there were individuals in the peninsula in Castile and Aragon who also died. There were some individuals who actually killed their own children lest they be baptized. We have many cases of that happening in the peninsula. It's not as commonly known, but it did happen. But I think for the most part, there was a sense that if we give in to the conversion, we survive, eventually things will stabilize and we'll be able to come back. Now, as I mentioned, from the Christian perspective, these initial conversions were met with a tremendous amount of excitement. But as I mentioned also, that would begin to wane very quickly. In the early period of about 1393, we have records from Movedre, it's one of the towns in Valencia on the eastern part of the peninsula, where inquisitors and the city officials knew that something would happen on Passover, and they actually sent raids to see if conversos were present. And sure enough, they caught people in the act, so to speak. Now, at the time, they were only finding these individuals. They figured, well, we'll give them more time. They'll learn that continuing to practice Judaism is not something that's acceptable. But eventually, they'll come around. Now, what's interesting is that the church made no significant effort to actually teach conversos about the principles of the Catholic faith. In the latter decades of the 15th century, there were actually catechisms that were being crafted to address this issue. But in the 1400s, 1410s, and 20s, there was no actual desire or emphasis put on actually teaching these conversos about their quote-unquote new faith. So just imagine, you're left to your own devices, you live in the same neighborhoods, you have Jewish family, you just sort of continue as you were. And as Rabbi Peter Tarlow would say, if you were a good Jew before, you would continue, and if you were not so good of a Jew, you'd probably continue on that trend as well. But these things become an issue of concern and of envy in the old Christian community. By the 1440s and 1450s, people are taking note that those individuals that were once Jewish are now the alcalde mayores, the town mayors and the jurados, the town councils, and they hold legal positions and positions of authority. But many of these individuals are apparently very flagrantly open about their continuing Jewish identity. And this becomes a point that is so contentious among the old Christian communities, is that we actually see violent riots and siege engines and attacks that happen not against Jews, not openly practicing Jews at least, but against conversos. And the Christian mentality evolves to the point of saying, we not only have to worry about Jews, now we have to worry essentially about a fifth column that has sort of bridged a gap or a line that we thought was drawn in the sand, and now they're in positions of authority, even in the church. Some of them were acting as bishops and as priests and so forth in various positions of authority. So in the 1450s, we see something very interesting happen. In Islamic mythology, if we want to call it that, there's the idea that Muhammad ascends to heaven from Jerusalem. And he rides a mythical horse. In Spanish, it's called El Alboraica. And this horse is like a composite animal. It's part horse and has different legs of different beasts. I mean, there are different depictions of it. But it's a hybrid. And there's actually a pamphlet that's written in the 1450s. But the El Alboraica is not an animal. It's the conversos. It's the crypto-Jews that Christians are seen as a threat in their midst, and it has to be dealt with. Now, the El Alboraica provides us with an interesting insight. I'm not going to quote it, but I'll paraphrase it. It tells us that there were some conversos, some anusim, some individuals who had been forced to convert, that were in fact fleeing to North Africa, for example. And the Jewish community would ask them, are you a anus? Are you a forced one? Or are you a meshumad? Are you a voluntary convert? And if the person said, I'm an anus, they would welcome them, they would support them, they would do everything possible to reintegrate them into the Jewish community. If they said, no, I'm a voluntary convert, I'm a meshumad, then they would basically not have anything to do with that individual. And what the scholar David Nierenberg tells us, returning to our point, is that the loss of identity as far as Christians understood it was something that was very unsettling. Because in the past, in earlier medieval periods, Jews had been depicted as demonic, as other, as subversive, as evil, as Christ killers, all the different labels that you can imagine. But now the conversos were challenging the very idea of the black and white imagery, because they weren't across that line. They were technically Christians, and this was something that was considered to be a major threat to the establishment of the church. We know, based on Inquisitional records, there were even monasteries where monks were arrested for celebrating different Jewish holidays. There were reports about individuals circumcising conversos who wished to undergo Brit Milah and return to the covenant. So from the perspective of the monarchs in Castile and Aragon, this was a religious threat that had to be confronted. The Muslims in the south in Granada may have represented a military threat. But from the perspective of the monarchs in Castile and Aragon, the spiritual threat was just as important. So much so that in the 1450s of the 15th century, we begin to see the beginnings of the limpieza de sangre laws take effect, the purity of blood laws. We don't want someone who is tainted with Jewish blood to occupy a certain post. Now, it will be decades before these things are rolled out and adopted by different universities and church orders and military orders, but it's a process that starts. And this is now a change that we have that is extremely important for us, certainly understanding history in the 20th century. In the medieval period and earlier times, there's something called the Siete Partidas. It was a law code that was devised by King Alfonso the Wise, and it had very strict definitions. Who is a Jew? A Jew is an individual who believes in the law of Moses, who is of the tribe of Judah. It gives you very basic definitions. They are to be respected, treated, et cetera, et cetera. But now, and the assumption was that an individual who converted to Christianity was no longer a Jew. Now they were a Christian, and that definition was no longer applicable to them. But in the 1400s, there's a major shift, because the idea is that if you have Jewish blood, you cannot erase that Jewish blood. You are tainted with something that will actually cause you to commit heresy. And so what we see in essence, because the purity of blood laws, believe it or not, actually continue to exist, at least in theory, into the 19th century. This idea of the purity of blood is the basis for the Nuremberg laws. The Nazis were not creating something out of thin air. They had a basis. They could look back and say, oh, this has been something that has been done before. And so what we see is that this amazing Jewish community in the peninsula is now under threat from a different standpoint. Its association with the Converso community is now a question that is perilous to itself. Now, what I'd like to do is, there's so many different points that we could continue to talk about. I'll note, of course, that the Inquisition continued to exist in its final form until about 1834, depending upon the region. Most of the Judaizing cases end sometime in the 1700s. But the 1500s and the late 1400s, 1500s, and into the 1600s are sort of the heyday of its focus on Judaizing. Now, many of the individuals that would later be converted under the Portuguese would sort of reinforce that converso identity, because many of the exiles from Spain or Castile and Aragon would actually flow into the Kingdom of Portugal, and they would in essence reinforce that Jewish identity that was in many ways dwindling among conversos who had been persecuted for the last several decades. Many of these individuals will eventually leave the peninsula and create Jewish communities in Amsterdam, Hamburg, London, in the Caribbean. And of course, as many of you know, the first 4 synagogues in the United States in the colonial period were actually founded primarily by Spanish and Portuguese Jews who were the descendants of conversos who had returned to Judaism, perhaps in Amsterdam, perhaps in Brazil, but they were all somewhat connected back to this sort of original community that, in essence, came out of the closet. What's fascinating about communities in Amsterdam, for example, is that the last practicing Jew in these communities had existed about 150 years before them. And in many cases, even longer than that. But through the support of a rabbi here and a rabbi there, they were able to recreate these unique Jewish communities that continue to this day. Now, what's interesting is that inevitably for those conversos who remained in the peninsula, there was a hybridization that did occur. We have the case of an individual, for example, whose name was Juan de Hoyo. In the early days of the Inquisition in Castile, he was noted by the Inquisition as a case of interest, and they asked him, "Are you a Christian?" And he said, "I'm not sure." And they said, "Well, do you believe in Jesus?" He goes, "Yes, but he's not the Messiah." And then he would go through this line of questioning where everything was garbled, and it was, the Messiah is going to come. I don't believe in the resurrection. It was a hodgepodge of different belief, and it highlights the fact that the church itself had not done an extensive job in actually teaching these conversos the fundamentals of Catholic faith. But at the same time, in many ways, it characterizes what would happen over the next centuries, because the idea of Jewishness that was retained among many of these conversos and their descendants were often simply semblances of the past. One of the individuals that we know of in Mexico, thanks to the records of the Mexican Inquisition, actually didn't circumcise himself in the normal way. What he did is he circumcised his shoulder and the shoulders of his family, because it was symbolic. It was a memory of something that they could sort of hold on to, and it would not cause a suspicion that circumcision. If you were circumcised, that was it. There was no way to explain that. There were attempts, right? I was born that way. That wasn't going to work. But if you circumcise, if you cut out a piece of your flesh in your shoulder, if you do something unique, you take a mitzvah or a minchag and you transform it so that you have an idea of what it means, but maybe no one else does. It served as a means of retaining some measure of Jewish identity for decades, if not centuries. Now, what's of course fascinating about the converso experience is that we see individuals even today in the 20th and the 21st century who have a genealogical connection, who have oral traditions in their family, who have done a DNA study, who have something that has drawn them to Judaism in some form or fashion. And for me, that in fact is one of the most fascinating aspects of this topic, because it's not simply a topic of historical interest, but it's actually something that has a living component to it. People are actually, in many ways, reinforcing the Jewish community that we have today. I'm very interested in demographic studies in the United States. I think there's one by the Pew Research study that comes out every 5 years or something like that, and they had done a study that in, I think, 2015 or 2020, there were something like 8.7 million Jews. I forgot the exact number. But then they recrafted it 5 years later, saying that you have to use religious identity or religious connection as the point of affiliation. So that number dropped down to something like 5.7 million. And in many ways, the converso question, or the history of the conversos, is the question of what does it mean to be a Jew? Who is a Jew? Is it an individual who is culturally Jewish? Is it an individual who is Israeli, who speaks Hebrew fluently but is not observant of the mitzvot? Is it an individual who is connected to the synagogue? What does it mean to be Jewish? And I think that this is the fundamental question that the conversos raise. One of the teachers, my great teacher, Rabbi Byron Sherwin of blessed memory, wrote a book, I think it was titled Faith Finding Meaning. And he talked about those conversos who escaped the peninsula and would join the communities in Amsterdam, the famous Portuguese synagogue, where they spoke Spanish and Portuguese and, of course, Hebrew. And what I sang yesterday was the En Kelohenu. I sang it in Hebrew and I sang it in Judeo-Espanol. And it says, ¿Quién como nuestro Dios? ¿Quién como nuestro Salvador? ¿Quién como nuestro... different terms, it slips my mind. And the question that Rabbi Sherwin raised is that when these individuals, these conversos who had been disconnected from Judaism for decades, if not centuries, when they heard those words, how did they understand it? Were they thinking about Redentor, Salvador, in the same sense as they had been trained as Catholics? Or were they changing their understanding to a more traditional Jewish perspective? They were a community that in many ways was in flux. And the reason that I mention that is because in many ways, I think you could find the argument that in the United States we have many of those same challenges. There was one rabbi who said that in America, Jews often approach Judaism from a Protestant perspective about what we believe, what we don't believe. It's a different perspective than one has been traditionally understood if we look at traditional rabbinic text. And that's why I believe that the converso story, the story of crypto-Jews, and these multifaceted identities speaks to us today, because it causes us to sort of analyze our own experience. How are we reinforcing our Jewish identity? If individuals in the past could survive secretly, even with the threat of the Inquisition and the possibility of being burnt at the stake, are we doing everything in our power to maintain a vibrant Jewish community that we can pass on to the next generation? Sometimes these conversos were operating only on a memory. My father told me this, my mother told me that. This is the one thing that they gave to me. And they built their restored Jewish lives around that perspective. Now, there are many individuals that we could talk about. I have a whole list, but we're sort of limited in time. But in many ways, they reflect the spectrum of the Jewish experience. Individuals who had studied in universities and began to sort of open up their minds to different ways of thinking. Maybe setting the framework for ideas about tolerance in the modern world. We have individuals who had left the peninsula, returned, or they escaped to Amsterdam, for example, but they weren't convinced about the necessity to return to Judaism, or their impression of Judaism was very different from what they encountered. In the peninsula, for example, they may have read the Apocrypha, that was part of the Catholic Bible. They read about the Maccabees, they read about the great patriarchs and so forth, but it didn't reconcile, it didn't match the image of rabbinic Judaism that they were confronted with in Amsterdam or London or in other places. And so they had their own crisis of faith that they had to sort of overcome. And so when we study these individuals, you can find, I think, elements that speak to us today and provide us with a tremendous amount of just an abundance of emotion, heartfelt journeys, individuals that often were not religious in the peninsula, but where they were arrested by the Inquisition, and they had sort of a come to Moses meeting, or come to Moses moment, where they said, I'm being persecuted for something that I'm not doing. I should do what I'm actually being accused of. And they become the great leaders of Amsterdam and many of these other communities. Now, I'll try to wrap things up. I wanted to share with you, there was a rabbi, his name was Saul Levi Mortera, one of the very famous rabbis of the Amsterdam community. They had several rabbis, one of them who was Isaac Aboab. He himself was a converso. He had fled the peninsula, returned to Judaism, and become a rabbi. And there was a great debate between them. Rabbi Saul Levi Mortera would deliver sermons. And his sermons, in many ways, are quite striking. He would talk about the fires of hell and damnation, which seems very out of place for a Jewish Devar Torah. But he believed so strongly that conversos that were still in the peninsula had to leave the peninsula, what he considered to be the lands of idolatry, because if they did not, they would suffer eternal damnation. Sounds very out of place. Isaac Aboab took a different perspective. He says, no, if they don't escape, they may have to undergo what's called Gilgul. They'll have to go reincarnation or the transmigration of souls. But eventually they will return to the people of Israel. Somehow they will, shall we say, be saved. And if you look at the perspectives of Rabbi Saul Levi Mortera and Isaac Aboab, they seem to be very different, but in essence it's the same. Their concern was to salvage and rescue the souls of individuals that had been distanced and one might say on the verge of being lost. We're talking about 150, 200 years, even more than they had openly practiced Judaism. This is how significant it was for these rabbis to bring these individuals back. And I think in some way, what we do at Zohar Yisrael, and I think also here at Temple Beth Israel, your openness and your embrace of individuals that are wanting to reconnect is that similar journey. We may not live under persecution, but it is not popular, as we all know, in the last several years, since October the 7th, to be a Jew, even in this great land. And so I know that you do it. I just want to encourage you to be open to those individuals that are truly seeking out the people of Israel, Hashem, to draw them in, because they can be the source, not of just the bracha, but of the reinvigoration of so many Jewish communities that are facing demographic challenges in our day and age. I'd like to stop and maybe open it up for a few questions if you'd like to ask. Yes?
Only because we have a local politician here whose last name ends in EZ, and I was expecting that they would hear about their ancestry with EZ. Is there anything significant of people with the last name ending in EZ?
Well, there's a lot of, it's difficult to say. I mean, some people say it's, there are sort of folkloric aspects to it. Some people say, I know Rabbi Peter Tarl talks about that quite a bit. I don't know if that's something that you can actually verify across the board. We find a lot of individuals in inquisitional records that have names that end in EZ, but they often reflect the names that were most popular at the time, because one of the major points is to dissimulate, right? You want to blend in. You don't want to be singled out. So you pick the Hernandez and Gomez and those kinds of names that are very popular because it's like a Smith. You don't want to stand out. There may be something there. It's not sort of an area that I've intensely focused in on, but I know that there are some people that do believe that there are certain patterns of names, maybe with animals or streams, trees, things of that nature that are sometimes indicative. One of the things that we have to remember is that immigration to the New World at different periods of Spanish and Portuguese history was illegal, although that never stopped anyone. But they would often switch names. They would create false genealogies and so forth to sort of get around whatever restrictions were in place. So it's quite possible, but I think you probably want to look at other oral traditions and things of that nature. So.